Welcome to Bridges KLC. We are glad that you're joining us today. I'm your host, Karen Connell, and I have with me some of my dearest friends and colleagues. Rhonda Knight, welcome.
Thank you, Karen.
Joan Montjoy, welcome.
It's good to be here.
Yay. And Roderick Hurd.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yay. I'm so glad that they're with me. I always enjoy discussing the Word with my friends. We are in the middle of a series called Stewarding the Gold, and we are in lesson number 5 of our series. And lesson number 5 is called Obstacles to Self-Care. We're talking about self-care and learning about it. In our last lesson, we were talking about our treasures and living large versus living small. Hiding our treasures, burying them, or digging them up and investing in them, growing in them, and growing our treasures so that it would bring glory to the one who gave us those treasures, which is God. And so today, as we're addressing obstacles to self-care, we're going to look at when we need fences, walls, and gates around our treasures. Around our lives. And a lot of this material was actually inspired, I want to give credit to where credit is due, by the book Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend. And I just would encourage, if you want to know more about this subject matter, to look at that book. It's an excellent resource. But we discovered that when we have treasures, we want to think that that's an exciting, wonderful thing, and it is, but sometimes people don't always feel excited and wonderful about our treasures. Sometimes that can solicit a very negative response from others. And if we allow other people's responses to dictate whether our treasures are legitimate or not, whether they actually came from God, and what their purpose is, then a lot of times we can end up hiding our treasures or burying our treasures if they're not well received. And we have to acknowledge we need to grow up in the Lord so that we can handle our treasures well, so that we can steward them according to the Father's pleasure and not our own pleasure.
Yes.
And we definitely don't want them hijacked and stewarded according to someone else's pleasure. And this is where building fences, walls, and gates come in. So let's look at Matthew 22:37-40 again, which we keep coming back to this scripture. Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, and on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." And then in John 19:30, Jesus said, "It is finished." The significance of these two scriptures, these two passages, are that Jesus lived his life so that all that God the Father had deposited in him got used the way the Father wanted it to be used. So at the end of his life, he could say, "It's finished. I've done it. I've done what the Father's called me to do." And even though he was 33 years old, and even though humanity had a massive amount of need left, he knew he had run his course. He had done what the Father had called him to do. So he did not allow his treasures to get hijacked. Mm-hmm. So I want us to just stop and think for a moment here, just the scene at Calvary, when the whole process, the Via Dolorosa, when Jesus was arrested, and he was beaten, he was tortured, he was mocked. The whipping he took, one more stripe would have killed a man.
Right.
And so just the physical state he was in was his weakest that he could ever be. And then they demanded he carry a cross that was far past his own weight, in which we find he couldn't bear alone. He fell under the weight of the cross, and someone else had to help him carry it, which that's a whole nother message that we could talk about. But what I will say about that is we will never finish our race alone. The weight of God's will in our lives is always greater than what we can do in our own power and strength.
Yes.
We must lean on the Father. And part of the way that God undergirds us is he brings his body alongside to help shoulder that weight. Mm-hmm. So with that, so let's go back to that scene the best that we can right now, and think about what all was at stake. He had already wrestled in the garden because he didn't want to face what was at stake here. What he was about to endure was beyond anything that he could imagine. He knew it was hideously horrible. And he was about to face his darkest hour. And 3 times he prayed to the Father, let this cup pass from me. And he finally relented and said, okay, not my will, but your will. Knowing that it was going to be a terrible journey. And he went forward because he saw you and I, for the joy that was set before him. The joy was having you and I restored back to the Father's heart.
Right.
And the joy of knowing the Father's pleasure would be fulfilled with us being united with the Father, a way back to the Father. But think about this. He was about to face beating, his beard torn out, his hair pulled out. He was going to be spit on. He was nearly naked, in front of a crowd of people. Shame put on him. And he was facing these things. And the greatest temptation I believe Jesus faced in the 33 years he lived here was the temptation to call upon his divinity when he hung on that cross.
Right.
Because the Father's will was for him to stay on that cross and die.
Right.
And pay the price, be the ransom for our sins. Imagine how weak Jesus was in that condition. And his mission was to be the bridge, was to be the ransom. If at any point he had called on his divinity and called the angels down to intervene and jumped off that cross, because he could have as the Son of God, the mission would have been aborted, and you and I would never be able to find our way back to the Father. It's so important for us to live first commandment first.
Yes.
If he had allowed the needs of other people, the desires of other people to dictate what he did on earth, when he faced his final hour, the darkest and most glorious hour of his life, he would not have had the strength and energy to obey God to its fullest, because he would have expended energy elsewhere.
Right.
God had given him all he needed to accomplish what God had called him to. The mistake we often make is we believe God has given us all we need to do what we think we're called to do, or someone else calls us to do. And then we expend energy doing this over here, and then we wonder why we peter out over here when God has called us here. And then with the things that God's called us to, we make excuses. We say, well, I'm just too tired, or I had to do all of this over here, so I can't give my best here. Imagine if Jesus was not able to give his best in that critical hour. He would not have made it, and he wouldn't have been able to overcome the temptation not to call on his divinity, which the Pharisees mocked him with.
Right.
You say you're the Son of God, save yourself.
Yes.
He was being tempted with that till his death, till he actually breathed his last. And the truth is, Jesus could have saved himself. But he chose to live for the Father's pleasure. He chose to live out of first commandment first, not what his mother at his feet was desiring, which was, my son is dying. I don't want to lose my son.
Yes.
Imagine how that pulled on his heart. Jesus overcame the same way we will overcome. He stayed in his lane when he ran his race. He knew what the Father had called him to do, and that is what we are called to do. We are to stay in our lane. I'm not to compare my journey with your journey, and I am not to worry about what you're doing. I am to do what the Father has called me to do, and I am to live as an expression of the Father's will and pleasure in my life. And that is why we need to learn about fences, walls, and gates. So consider some questions as we move forward. What are some obstacles, that you might be facing when it comes to the treasures in your life and living out those treasures and living from the Father's pleasure? Where does there need to be a fence in your life so everybody just doesn't come in and out and just take that treasure whenever they want, and they decide, hey, I want this treasure used here, and I want it used here, and I want it used here, to where you're spent. And so when the Father says, oh, I've called you to do this, you don't have the energy to do it.
Yes.
Or to do it well. And where does there need to be a gate? Meaning, if you build a fence around the property lines of your life, then where does there need to be a gate where sometimes God has called some people to enter into your life and enter into, partake of your treasures, to enjoy your treasures. And then the gate swings both ways, and then they're supposed to leave at times too. And where does a wall need to come down? If there are walls in our life, and oftentimes we build walls because we've been hurt, we've been disappointed, because somebody has not respected or valued, not stewarded what we've given them well. And our response in our own strength is, well, I'll just build a wall and I'll never do that again. I'm not going to let you see that again. And then where does a wall need to be built? We need to recognize where the enemy comes after our treasures. And that's where we need to build a wall. So let's talk about fences right now. Excuse me. A fence is a boundary. A fence defines a property line that distinguishes what belongs to you and what does not. If we don't have a clear boundary line, it is difficult to know what is yours and what is not. It is also difficult for others to know what is theirs and what is not.
Right.
Okay, that's significant. That's important. There are consequences to no or poor fence lines. Others use your treasures while you're caring for their treasures, and your own are neglected in the process. So just imagine, I like to just bring this down to real simple analogies. Imagine you literally have a yard that you're responsible for, and you have a lawnmower, and you're supposed to cut your grass, and you have a weed eater, and you're supposed to trim the weeds, and you're in your yard, but you have no fences, and your neighbor has no fences, and your neighbor comes over and takes your lawnmower and cuts their grass with their lawnmower, and there's no gas left in the lawnmower, and it's time for your grass to be cut. Okay, that's a problem. Or imagine, same scenario, you're in your yard, they're in their yard, and there are no property lines, there are no boundaries, there are no fences, and you're out cutting your grass, and your neighbor says, hey, Roderick, while you're at it, why don't you cut down here also? And they point to their yard. And there you go, you're pointing, you say, okay, and you go right ahead with no thought to, are you really supposed to do that, or what's on your schedule? And because you're overcutting their grass, you're not taking care of the fact that you're supposed to go pick up your kids at school now, and you're late picking up your kids because you're taking care of, Billy Bob's yard next door instead of just taking care of your own. And oftentimes that's what happens in our lives when we don't have fences. So we need to ask ourselves in our own life, whose yard am I taking care of? Am I taking care of my own yard? Or am I trying to take care of someone else's yard? Are there people in my life who are expecting me to take care of their yard at the expense of taking care of my own yard?
Or taking care of something else that God has for you. Because if we really think about it, even our time, our treasures, if we're offering them back to Him, what does He want you to be doing?
Exactly. So anytime I am spending time, energy, resources in someone else's yard and God has not called me to that, I am out of bounds. And then what that does is it sets up a victim mentality, because then when it's time for me to complete the task in my yard, I run out of gas. I don't have gas in my lawnmower. I run out of gas in my body. I'm tired. I'm worn out. And I run out of time. And so with that, then I feel like a victim, because I'm like, how come there's not enough for me? And where's the people to help me? When, in fact, God gave me the resources. I chose to spend those resources on someone else's yard instead of my own yard, because I refuse to define what is mine that God has called me to steward.
Right.
Roderick, you have a
And
thought?
I was thinking also for that neighbor you're talking about, every time I go out and mow my lawn, it's that expectation that you're going to do this, you're going to mow my lawn as well. And so we're setting ourselves up for the expectation to be there, that you're going to do this because you've always done it.
Exactly. I always say we're educating horizontally the people alongside of us. We're educating up the people who might be our supervisors over us, and we're educating those who are following us. We're educating them. We're informing them, this is what I believe, and this is how you can treat me. This is what you can expect from me,
Yes.
based on how I live my life, the choices I make.
I found that happened to me a lot in the workplace when I worked in corporate America, and that I would find myself very tired and resentful. And I realized, wait a minute, I'm not a victim here. I'm giving this time and energy to them, but then I'm angry about it. And it was because I didn't have proper fences up. I couldn't say, no, this is when the day ends. And to go back to your analogy, no, I'm not going to mow this lawn and this lawn and this lawn because I saw an endless field in front of me. But, I believe in working and a proper work ethic, but this is what I'm contracted to do, and this is what the Lord's called me to do. And then I had to put up a boundary, which I had to learn does not make me a mean or a bad person to have a boundary.
Correct.
It just helped me to go from being a good girl to a godly woman, and to use my voice and my power and have a holy no that says, this is what I will do and this is what I won't, and then offer up that time to the Lord. And now what do you have for me, Lord?
Exactly. And those fences, what it does is it secures the treasures, it secures the resources, so that we can actually live by First Commandment first. We can live loving God first. We can live according to what He's called us to, instead of living according to what everyone else wants us to live by, or what we think they need.
Right.
And so it secures those treasures. Now, because oftentimes we don't have good boundaries with fences, and we develop that victim mentality, and we get victimized, oftentimes that sets us up for people to take advantage of us, then as our reaction, we build walls.
Right.
And that's where we make those statements, those judgments. I will never do that again. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to be this. And we just wall everyone out, and we wall our treasures in. And we just decide the cost is too high. I'm not going to do that. And walls oftentimes can look like false humility or self-deprecation, with statements like this. See if any of these ring true for you. I'm not important. I'm not as important as, and the list can go on and on. Name whoever you want to compare yourself to. Your needs are more important than my needs. Your needs are greater than my needs. I'm not good enough. Everybody has this, so they don't need me anyway. No one would want what I have. I don't need anyone else. And I'm better when I'm on my own. And you can go on and on with this list. Have any of those rung true in your life?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Say all of them.
Oh, yeah.
At some point.
And even more.
At some point.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah, I know.
yes.
At some point in my own life, matter of fact, that's how I wrote them, because they were very familiar. I was very familiar with those statements. It's a way we self-protect. It's a way that we say, you know what, I don't want to be used, abused, taken advantage of, exploited. I don't want to be hurt. I don't want to be disappointed. So I'm going to build a wall, and I'm going to make sure you can't cross that property line ever, and you're never going to get what's inside of here. But the problem with that is then we bury our treasure, and it never comes out, and we don't get to live from the fullness of that treasure either, because all the graces of God come with that treasure. His pleasure is tied to the treasure he puts inside of us. And so what we're doing is we are walling off the pleasure of God. We are walling it in, and we are then making a decree, so to speak. I will live small. My life will be small. And nothing's getting in and nothing's getting out that can challenge it or grow it. There are times for good walls.
Yes.
That's when it's a spiritual battle and we're battling the enemy of our soul. And God builds those walls in our life. So let's talk about good walls. In Psalm 18:2, it says, a mighty fortress is our God. In Proverbs 18:10, it says, he is a strong tower. In Psalm 61:3, he is our refuge. And in Psalm 46:1, it says, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. This is the antidote to our desire to protect ourselves. It is to lean into God when we realize maybe we haven't had good boundaries, maybe we have allowed ourselves to be used or exploited, and we realize that it's wrong, that we are to come back to him. We are to ask him to forgive us for our poor boundaries. That's our responsibility. Our boundaries are our responsibility. We're to ask him to heal us and comfort us where we've been wounded in this process. And then we are to ask him to build a wall around us to live under his protection as we live from our treasures and his pleasure in our lives. And this is key. This comes back to relationship. In Zechariah 4:6, it says, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. God wants to build a holy wall of protection around us as we learn to tap in to his pleasure and allow his pleasure to be expressed through the treasures he's deposited in our lives. Now that moves us, let's move on to gates. And this is where community comes in. Gates are the opening in our fences and our walls. Gates are where someone is able to come in and someone is able to leave. And there are times in our life where I call them divine disconnections, where God does a pruning. John chapter 15. Thank you. I was going to say 9, but chapter 15 talks about the vine and the pruning. There are times when it's divine disconnections. God prunes relationships, he prunes activities, he prunes, but the goal is always for more fruit to be developed in our life. Pruning is always to prepare us and create a capacity for more. In John 15 it says, I am the true vine and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that bears not fruit he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit he purges it, that it might bring forth more fruit. So what I want to encourage all of you is this, is as you're considering your treasures, Where do your property lines begin and end? Where does a fence need to be built? Where have you established walls to protect yourself that need to come down and allow Jesus to become that mighty fortress for you? And then finally consider the gates. What is being pruned so God can create for more? What does he want out of your property to go through the gate? And then what is he inviting in? The more is what is he inviting in? And that is what will enter through the gate of your life. And in each season, sometimes that changes. The things that he called for one season in my life changed in the next season. And he would call for a divine disconnection. It was like, okay, Karen, it's time for these things now to go out the gate. Because I want to make room for what I have for you in this next season, and there's not room for both. And so in order to receive those things, I have to be able to let go of the things that he is calling me to let go for in each season. Which brings us back to relationship. Walking in intimate relationship with the Father will allow us to know what he's called us to for each season. So as we go today, I just want you to consider the treasures that you have. Are they being hidden behind a wall? Or are they being used for the Father's pleasure? And where do you need to build up fences so that you can protect those treasures and others can't come and use them for their desire? And where are the gates supposed to be? And are they in place? What needs to leave out of your life right now so that it creates capacity for the more? Any final thoughts on that as we close? From each of you?
I was trying to think. There's so many thoughts. There's been a divine disconnect in my life just this past fall, and it was very difficult because it required a major shift in my life that I'd never experienced before. And I had to hold tight to God, to trust that when I moved from what I've known my whole life into the unknown, that he would be there for me, and that he did have a plan in it. I wasn't just, okay, I'm just not going to do this anymore. Because a lot of people didn't understand, still don't understand. And you have to shut the gate on those people and say, I love you, but I've got to stay here or move this direction. It's difficult. When God calls, it's never easy.
Exactly. But I'm so grateful he gives us the grace for that. Thank you for joining us today on Bridges KLC. We look forward to seeing you on our next program every first and second Saturday.
Yes. Divine disconnect.